On my 16th birthday, the man I'd called Dad for 12 years threw a $10 bill at my face and said, "Get out. I'm done paying for another man's trash." He thought he'd destroyed me. He had no idea I had an envelope in my pocket that would take away his home, his job, and his dignity. And outside, in a black SUV, waited the one man my father feared more than death. My real father. My name is Clara Sterling, and I have just turned 16. On the morning of my birthday, the man I had called father for 12 years threw a $10 bill at my face. "Get out," he said, his voice flat and cold. "I'm finished paying for another man's refuse." He expected those words to break me. He truly believed that a crumpled bill and a slammed door would be the end of my story. He had no realization that it was only the prologue. I picked up the money, looked him dead in the eye, and smiled. Without a word, I handed him the sealed cream envelope I had been guarding for 2 years. I knew every syllable written inside. He ripped it open, his face draining of color, as his eyes scanned the pages. Then he glanced toward the window and froze. Outside, through the heavy Denver snow, a black SUV was idling at the curb. The driver's door opened. A tall man in a dark wool coat stepped out and began walking toward our front porch. His presence made my so-called father look as though he was staring at a ghost. To understand why that man was here, and why Bruno's hands were now shaking, I have to go back to the beginning. I still remember the day the blizzard buried the mountain passes, the year I turned 4. The phone call came while I was coloring at the kitchen table. Laura answered, then simply dropped the receiver. She didn't cry at first. She just stared at the floral wallpaper until Bruno walked in from the garage. One look at her face and he knew my parents were gone. Black ice. A jackknifed rig. Instant. The funeral was a blur of grey. I wore a navy coat 3 sizes too large and gripped Bruno's hand because everyone whispered that he was my only family now. He and Laura stood at the front with me between them, the perfect portrait of a grieving brother and sister-in-law stepping up to do their duty. People kept saying how fortunate I was to have them. They moved me into their house in the suburbs that same week. For a while, the facade held. There were Christmas cards where all 4 of us smiled. Bruno taught me to ride a bike in the driveway. Laura braided my hair for school pictures. I called them Mom and Dad because that was the role they had cast themselves in, and as a child, I didn't know any better. But everything shifted when Toby was born. I was 6 then. Suddenly, there were new toys and clothes that were strictly for the baby. My old stuffed bear vanished. My bedroom was converted into a nursery, and I was moved to a cramped, drafty room at the back of the house that smelled of mothballs and neglect. By the time I was 8, the disparity was impossible to ignore. Toby received a shiny new mountain bike for Christmas. I was given a scratchy sweater from a clearance rack. When I dared to ask why, Bruno would only shrug. "You're older, Clara. You don't require as much." Laura would offer a tight, artificial smile and talk over me. My 9th birthday passed without a single mention. No cake, no candles, no song. I sat on my bed until the clock struck midnight, waiting for someone to remember. No one did. I wept until I was sick, then cleaned the bathroom floor myself so they wouldn't have a reason to be angry. The true awakening happened the winter I turned 10. I had gone downstairs for a glass of water and heard hushed voices coming from the kitchen. The lights were off, but the hallway was slivered with gold from the crack under the door. I pressed my ear to the wood. "My brother's trust is sitting at 1.2 million, Bruno's voice was low, almost a growl. Plus the life insurance payout brings the total to 1.6. As long as we keep her until she's 18, we control every cent. The state even pays us a stipend because we are listed as her legal guardians. No one is auditing us. Laura let out a soft, sharp laugh. And when she turns 18, we are done. She gets whatever remains, if there is anything left. Until then, we just keep playing the part of the happy family. I stood frozen in the dark. The glass slipped from my hand and shattered against the hardwood. The kitchen light flicked on instantly. Bruno appeared in the doorway, his eyes narrowing into slits. Go back to bed, Clara. That was the first time he used my name like a threat. From that night on, I understood my place in that house. I was a paycheck in human form. Every forced smile for the neighbors and every staged family photo was merely a performance. I stopped asking for things. I stopped expecting birthdays. Instead, I started watching, listening, and waiting for the day I could dismantle their lies. Those words from the kitchen haunted me for the next 4 years. I stopped sleeping soundly, jolting awake at every creak in the hallway, terrified they would decide I was no longer useful. I began searching the house for anything that could explain why they treated me like a line item on a ledger. I went through every drawer, every forgotten box in the attic. Nothing. Not until the week of my 14th birthday. I was cleaning out a guest closet, a chore Laura assigned me every season, when my hand brushed against cold metal at the very back. It was a small, grey lockbox with a simple padlock. A strip of faded masking tape across the lid bore my mother's handwriting. Open only when you are 14. I love you forever, Mom. I carried it to my room, my heart hammering against my ribs. Using a paper clip and a tutorial I'd found online, I picked the lock in minutes. Inside was a single envelope of thick cream paper, sealed with red wax. I broke the seal with trembling fingers. The letter was 3 pages long, dated just 2 months before the crash. My sweetest Clara, it began. If you are reading this, I am no longer there to protect you. Before I married your father, I was in a brief relationship with a man named Marcus Thorne. We were young, and it ended when he moved away for his career. I thought that chapter was closed, but 3 months later, I discovered I was pregnant with you. I never told Marcus. I married your father because I loved him, and I wanted you to have a stable home. But I have seen how Bruno looks at money. I have seen the way he talks about the trust. I am afraid that after I'm gone, he will try to seize everything meant for you. The letter detailed the trust, 1.2 million from my grandparents and the insurance money. It was in my name alone, with Bruno acting only as a temporary trustee. My mother had even hired an attorney, Sarah Miller, to keep a quiet watch over the accounts. Her card was taped to the inside of the lid. Along with the letter was a lock of hair, and a copy of my original birth certificate, where the father was listed as unknown. If you ever need proof of who your real father is, use this. You are not a burden, Clara. You are my miracle. All my love, Mom. I read it until the words blurred. Marcus Thorne. The name was a lifeline. I found the attorney's card exactly where Mom said it would be. The next day, using a library computer, I sent an email under a pseudonym. Sarah Miller replied within 20 minutes. If you are Jennifer's daughter, call me immediately. I called from a payphone near the grocery store. Sarah's voice was calm and professional, but there was an underlying urgency. She was already aware of discrepancies in the trust. She had been waiting for me to find her. She sent me a discreet DNA kit to a secure location. I waited until Bruno left his hairbrush on the counter, took the samples, and mailed them back. 17 days later, the results arrived. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. Marcus Thorne was my father. I sat on the floor of a public library bathroom, and cried until I was empty. Then I wiped my face, walked out, and began the long game. The next 2 years were a countdown. Marcus contacted me the same night Sarah forwarded him the results. His first message was brief: "I should have known." We started slowly, one message a week, then every few days. He never pressured me. When I finally sent him a photo of the lockbox, he replied with a voice note. His voice broke when he said my name. He wanted to fly to me instantly, but I begged him to wait. In this state, 16 was the pivotal age. At 16, I could petition the court to change my guardianship if I could prove my interests were being harmed. Sarah had already drafted the paperwork. We just needed the right moment to serve it. So, I lived the lie. I smiled, I helped Toby with his schoolwork, and I played the part of the quiet, obedient ward. Inside, I was counting the seconds. The morning I turned 16 arrived grey and silent. There were no celebrations. Toby was already at school, Laura was out at a fitness class. Bruno sat at the kitchen island, scrolling through his phone in his expensive suit. I walked in, still in the clothes I'd slept in. He didn't even look up. He simply reached into his wallet, flicked a $10 bill across the counter, and told me to get out. He called me another man's trash. He thought he was finally discarding a burden. He had no idea he was hand-delivering me my freedom. The letter was 3 pages long, written in a hand that was both elegant and hurried. "My sweetest Clara," it began. "If you are reading this, I am no longer there to protect you. Before I married the man you knew as your father, I was in a brief, intense relationship with a man named Marcus Thorne. We were young, and when he moved away for his career, I thought that chapter was closed. I discovered I was pregnant with you only after he was gone. I never told him. I married your father because I loved him, and I wanted you to have a name and a home. But I have seen the way Bruno looks at money. I have seen how he speaks of the trust. I am terrified that once I am gone, he will try to consume everything meant for your future." The numbers were laid out with chilling clarity. A trust of $1.2 million from my grandparents, and another $400,000 from life insurance. It was mine, solely mine, with Bruno acting only as a temporary steward until I reached adulthood. My mother had been wise. She had retained an attorney named Sarah Miller in downtown Denver to keep a silent watch. Her card was there, tucked into the velvet lining of the box, alongside a lock of my mother's hair and my original birth certificate, where the father's name was simply a blank line. "If you ever need to prove who you are, use this. You are not a burden, Clara. You are my miracle. All my love, Mom." I read those pages until the ink seemed to vibrate. Marcus Thorne. The name was a phantom that suddenly had weight and bone. I found Sarah Miller's office online the next morning at the school library, sending a message from a burner account. She responded in less time than it took for me to finish my lunch break. "If you are Jennifer's daughter, call me now." I stood at a payphone outside a rainy gas station, my heart hammering against my ribs. Sarah's voice was like polished stone, smooth, firm, and unbreakable. She had been waiting for me for years, watching the trust's balances fluctuate with growing concern. She sent a DNA kit to a secure locker at the bus station. I waited until the house was silent, snatched a few strands of hair from Bruno's brush just to be certain of the contrast, and mailed the samples away in a plain cardboard box. 17 days later, the report arrived. The probability of paternity for Marcus Thorne was 99.9%. I sat on the cold tile of the library bathroom and shook with a silent, violent sob that felt like it would tear my chest open. Then I stood up, washed my face, and went to the only person I could trust. Maya had been my shadow since the 6th grade, the only person who saw through the Sterling family's polished exterior. I showed her the letter and the DNA results in the dim light of her bedroom. She didn't say a word, she just pulled me into a hug so tight I could finally breathe. We spent that night on her floor, whispering over maps and legal definitions, cursing Bruno and Laura in hushed, angry tones. For the first time in a decade, I wasn't fighting a ghost. I had an army of two. The next 2 years were a masterpiece of deception. Marcus emailed me the same night Sarah forwarded the results to him. His first message was a single, devastating sentence: "I should have known the moment I saw her face in my dreams." We moved slowly. One message a week turned into daily check-ins. He never pushed for a meeting, never demanded a phone call until I told him I was ready. When I finally sent him a photo of the lockbox, he sent back a voice note. The sound of his voice, thick with unshed tears as he said my name, became my anchor. In our state, 16 was the threshold. At 16, I could legally petition for a change of guardianship if I could prove my current situation was a breach of my best interests. Sarah had the filings ready months in advance. We waited for the clock to run out. I played my part at home with terrifying precision. I smiled at Bruno. I helped Toby with his math. I nodded when Laura complained about the cost of my school shoes. Inside, I was counting down 730 days. The morning of my 16th birthday was cold and sharp. No one had made breakfast. There were no cards on the table. Toby had already left for practice, and Laura was at her studio. Bruno sat at the kitchen island, the morning light catching the expensive silk of his tie. He didn't look at me. He simply reached into his wallet, pulled out a crisp $10 bill, and flicked it across the granite so it landed in a puddle of spilled coffee. "Get out," he said, his voice devoid of any human warmth. "I'm done paying for another man's trash." The words were meant to be a killing blow, but I had been armor-plating myself for 2 years. I picked up the bill, folded it slowly, and tucked it into my pocket. Then, I pulled a thick manila envelope from my bag. "I know," I said. He snorted, a jagged, ugly sound. "Know what, exactly?" I slid the envelope across the counter. Inside was a temporary order signed by a district judge the previous afternoon, effective immediately. There was the certified DNA report, and a petition citing 12 years of fiduciary fraud and systemic neglect. His fingers began to tremble as he tore the seal. Page after page of his own forged signatures stared back at him from the shadows of the trust accounts. That was when the doorbell rang. Bruno froze, the papers rustling in his shaking hands. I walked past him, my footsteps echoing on the hardwood I had polished 1,000 times for no thanks. I opened the door. Marcus Thorne stood on the porch. He was tall, dressed in a charcoal wool coat, with snowflakes caught in his dark hair. Sarah Miller stood a step behind him, her briefcase gripped firmly in her hand. Marcus's eyes, the exact same shade of slate gray as mine, locked onto my face for the first time in the real world. He didn't smile, the moment was too heavy for that. He stepped into the foyer, his boots leaving damp prints on the floor, and spoke with a finality that made the very walls seem to shrink. "I'm here for my daughter," he said, his voice calm and lethal. "Your claim on her ended the moment you decided she was something to be discarded." Bruno opened his mouth, but for once, he had run out of lies. The air in the living room turned leaden the moment Marcus closed the heavy oak door behind him. No one moved. No one breathed. Even the grandfather clock in the foyer seemed to hitch between ticks. Bruno stood there, clutching the temporary guardianship order, as if it were written in an ancient, undecipherable language. His mouth opened and closed in a silent rhythm, nothing escaping his throat but a thin, rattled sound. Sarah Miller clicked open her leather attaché, with the practiced grace of someone who had done this 100 times. She laid a dark green folder on the coffee table, the gold-embossed seal of the Colorado Superior Court catching the light, and slid it toward the center so the signatures faced Bruno. "This is a temporary order, effective as of 9:30 this morning," she said, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. Judge Sutherland has signed off. Clara is no longer your ward. If you attempt to prevent her from leaving, the authorities will be here before lunch. Bruno's eyes finally found their focus. He flipped to the final page, saw the judge's ink, and the paper slipped from his fingers, as if the heat of it had finally burned him. Marcus never raised his voice. He simply reached into a second folder, and began placing documents on the glass table one by one. Each sheet landed with a soft, rhythmic thud that echoed in the stillness. A bank withdrawal slip for $8,000, the memo line noted a tuition deposit for Toby's private academy. Toby had been enrolled in the local public school his entire life. Next came a wire transfer for $12,000 to a luxury dealership for a white SUV registered in Laura's name. It was dated the same month I had been told that my teeth would simply have to stay crooked because braces were a luxury we couldn't afford. Then, a resort reservation for a holiday in the Caymans, $43,000 for a week of turquoise water and 5-star service. I spent that Christmas eating cold cereal in the dark while they sent postcards from the tropics. Marcus kept going. A loan for a mountain boat in Bruno's name. Elite hockey fees and travel expenses for Toby that totaled more in a single season than had been spent on me in 4 years. A casino advance from a high-stakes room in Las Vegas, signed with the trust's debit card. Every sheet was a confession. $212,000 over 12 years. Every cent stolen while I wore second-hand coats and learned never to ask for a second helping of dinner. Laura had slipped in through the garage entrance during the presentation. She stood under the archway in her lavender athletic gear, her stainless steel bottle trembling so violently the ice inside rattled against the metal. I didn't. I never signed any of those, she stammered, her voice cracking. Marcus finally turned his gaze toward her. Your signature appears on 14 of these withdrawals, Laura. You can refresh your memory on page 27. Her knees seemed to give way. She caught the door frame to remain upright. From the landing above came the creak of floorboards. Toby appeared, clad in his university-branded pajamas, his hair messy and his eyes wide with confusion. He looked at the mountain of evidence, at his father's ghost-white face, and then at Marcus, a man who looked like a more formidable, shadow-wrapped version of me. He said nothing, he just stared at the proof that every game console and ski trip he'd ever enjoyed had been purchased with a dead woman's legacy. Sarah closed her briefcase with a sharp, final snap. The sheriff's civil division is on standby, she said. We would prefer to keep this quiet for the sake of the neighborhood, but that is entirely up to you. Bruno finally found his voice, though it was raw and jagged. You can't prove intent. I'll fight you. I'll drag this through the appellate courts for years. You'll lose, Thorne. Marcus stepped forward, his presence filling the room. And when you do, the district attorney receives the forgery file. 18 counts of felony fraud, minimum. We are offering you the chance to keep this a civil matter. I suggest you take it. He turned to me then and held out his hand. I took it. His palm was warm and steady, a constant in a world that had always been shifting beneath my feet. I grabbed the duffel bag I'd hidden behind the sofa the night before. Inside were 3 hoodies, 2 pairs of jeans, and my mother's lockbox wrapped in a t-shirt. As we walked toward the door, Bruno began to shout. Threats of lawyers and ruin followed us down the hall, but they lost their power with every step I took. Marcus opened the door of the idling SUV. I climbed into the back, Sarah took the passenger seat, and the driver eased away from the curb without a word. The snow continued to fall, thick and relentless, veiling the only home I had ever known until it disappeared into a curtain of white. For the first time in my life, I wasn't cold. Winter returned to the city months later, on the night of the regional bank's annual charity gala. The grand ballroom was a sea of crystal chandeliers and black tie elegance. Hundreds of guests milled around silent auction tables, bidding on mountain retreats and private dinners with the governor. Every dollar was pledged to the children's hospital, or so the gilded banners claimed. Bruno still held his title as branch president. The board hadn't moved against him yet. The internal review was moving with the glacial pace of corporate bureaucracy. He sat at the head table in a rented tuxedo, wearing a practiced smile and shaking hands, as if his world weren't held together by fraying threads. He had no idea that the lead sponsor of the evening had changed at the 11th hour. Marcus had quietly pledged $300,000 the week the invitations were mailed. The bank's CEO had called him personally to express his gratitude, never questioning why a shipping magnate from out of state cared so much about a local fundraiser. I walked into the room on Marcus's arm, wearing a floor-length gown of navy silk. Heads turned, and a ripple of whispers followed us across the marble floor. We stopped at table after table. Marcus's introduction was always the same. "I'd like you to meet my daughter, Clara." Some guests recognized the sterling name and did the math in their heads. Others simply smiled, charmed by the sudden appearance of a Thorn heir. When the dinner concluded, the lights dimmed for the keynote address. Marcus was scheduled to give the sponsors remarks before the live bidding began. He squeezed my hand once and walked up the 3 steps to the stage. The room fell into a hushed expectant silence. Marcus took the microphone, scanned the crowd, and gave the easy, confident smile of a man who moved empires. "Good evening. Tonight, we have raised a staggering amount for the hospital, and I am honored to be a part of that legacy. But before we begin the auction, there is someone I want you to truly see." He turned to me. I rose from our table and walked up the steps into the white-hot glare of the spotlight. 300 faces stared back. "This," Marcus said, his voice steady and resonant, "is my daughter, Clara Sterling. For 16 years, I was kept from her. For 12 of those years, she was told she was a burden while the very people sworn to protect her used her inheritance to fund their own luxuries. But she is no longer a secret, and she is certainly no longer alone." A collective gasp swept through the ballroom. At the head table, Bruno stood up so abruptly his chair screeched against the floor. His wine glass tipped, and dark red Cabernet surged across the white linen tablecloth like an open wound. I entered on Marcus's arm, the navy silk of my gown whispering against the marble floors. Every head in the room turned. Phones were raised, and a tide of hushed speculation followed us as we moved through the crowd. We stopped at table after table. Marcus's introductions were repetitive, deliberate, and devastatingly simple. "I'd like you to meet my daughter, Clara." Some guests recognized the name Sterling and immediately began doing the silent math of local scandal. Others simply smiled with the polite, empty grace of the wealthy. A few asked where I went to school, and I answered with the truth for the first time in my life, that I was finishing my semester through an online academy while we finalized the transfer of my legal guardianship. The master of ceremonies tapped the microphone, signalizing the end of dinner. The chandeliers dimmed as the room prepared for the live auction. Marcus was scheduled to give the lead sponsor's address just before the high-ticket items. He squeezed my hand once, a grounding pressure, and then climbed the 3 steps to the stage. The ballroom fell silent. Marcus took the mic, his gaze sweeping over the sea of black ties and evening gowns. He gave the easy, confident smile of a man who moved millions with a signature. "Good evening, Denver. We've already seen incredible generosity tonight for the Children's Hospital, and I am proud to stand among you. But before we open the bidding on the luxury mountain retreats, there is someone I want you to meet." He turned his gaze toward me. I rose from our table at the front and walked up the steps. The spotlight found me, blinding and hot. 300 faces stared back. A wave of smartphones rose in unison. "This," Marcus said, his voice resonant and steady, "is my daughter, Clara Sterling. 16 years ago, I didn't know she existed. 4 months ago, she found me." A collective, sharp intake of breath rippled through the hall. At the head table, Bruno stood so violently his chair screeched against the floorboards and toppled. His wine glass slipped, and a surge of dark red Cabernet drenched the white linen, dripping onto the carpet like an open wound. A voice from the back of the room carried through the silence. "Wait, isn't that the branch president's niece?" Marcus didn't falter. Clara spent her life being told she was a burden. She was denied the most basic necessities, while the money intended for her care and education was used to buy luxury vehicles and vacations for others. But she never stopped fighting for the truth. And now, she is finally home. The whispers escalated into a low roar of conversation. People weren't even trying to hide their recording. Bruno's face cycled through every shade of crimson and ash. He took a stumbling step toward the stage, as if he intended to charge it, but Laura grabbed his sleeve, hissing something into his ear that made him freeze. Marcus simply wrapped a protective arm around my shoulders. "Thank you for allowing me to share this moment with her. Let's make this a record-breaking night for the children who truly need our help." He handed me the microphone for the ceremonial start of the auction. My hand didn't shake. By the time we stepped down from the stage, the video was already trending. That night, the city's leading digital paper carried a single, searing image: Bruno Sterling frozen in a mid-stumble, wine spreading across the table, while Marcus Thorne and I stood bathed in the spotlight. The headline was a killing blow: Billionaire shipping heir reclaims daughter in dramatic gala reveal, local executive's reputation in tatters. The civil trial opened in the Colorado Superior Court on a biting April morning. Courtroom 3 smelled of floor wax and old paper. The gallery was sparse: reporters, a bank compliance officer, and a few neighbors whose curiosity had been piqued by the gala scandal. Bruno sat at the defense table in a navy suit that hung loose on his frame, his posture defeated. Laura sat 2 rows behind him, clutching a damp tissue she never actually used. Toby was absent, kept away by the start of the school term. Sarah Miller arrived with 4 heavy banker's boxes on a metal cart, wheeling them past the bar like she was delivering a verdict in paper form. The bailiff called the room to order as Judge Sutherland took the bench. There was no jury. This was a matter of financial law and fiduciary duty. Sarah's opening statement was a surgical strike. "Your Honor, we will demonstrate that for 12 years, the defendant, acting as the sole trustee for a minor, systematically siphoned $212,000 for his personal gain. Every withdrawal was a violation of the state's fiduciary statutes. We are seeking full restitution, statutory interest, and all associated legal fees." Bruno's attorney attempted to argue for reasonable family expenses and broad trustee discretion, but the judge cut him off within seconds. "Save the rhetoric for your evidence, counsel." Sarah called me to the stand first. I wore a simple charcoal blazer Marcus had bought for me. I took the oath, the words feeling like a final seal on my past. I described the reality of my childhood, the second-hand clothes, the lack of a phone until I worked to pay for it myself, the school trips I was never allowed to attend. As I spoke, Sarah projected documents onto the large screen. She showed a check Bruno had signed for a high-end home theater system, dated the same month he told me we couldn't afford new shoes for the winter. Then came the bank statements. 4 boxes of evidence became 400 pages of betrayal, projected one by one. A $5,000 withdrawal was labeled as orthodontic expenses. I turned toward the judge and showed him my teeth, still crooked, never touched by a brace. Then, a $22,000 wire transfer to a travel agency for a luxury getaway to Hawaii. I had spent that entire week at a neighbor's house while the rest of the family flew across the Pacific. The jeweler's receipt was for $38,000. It was for the very same diamond earrings Laura had worn to the gala. As each page of the bank statements was projected onto the screen, the forged signatures of the trustee filled the courtroom with the stench of betrayal. Bruno stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched so tight the muscle jumped in his cheek. Sarah Miller rested her case after 2 hours. The defense, having no ground to stand on, called no witnesses. Bruno's attorney asked for a recess, but the judge shook his head. "I have seen quite enough, counsel," Judge Sutherland said, removing his spectacles. The closing was a surgical strike. Sarah spoke of an orphan robbed by the very man who pretended to be her protector. The judge didn't hesitate. "Judgment for the plaintiff," he announced, the gavel falling with the finality of a gunshot. $212,000 in principal, 8% annual interest from the date of each wrongful withdrawal, and $48,000 in legal fees. Total due within 30 days. Case closed. The fallout was swift and absolute. The bank terminated Bruno the following Monday, citing a catastrophic loss of public trust and a breach of their ethical code. He was forced to clear his desk before the lunch hour. 3 weeks later, a foreclosure notice was pinned to the front door of the house in the suburbs. The very bank that had once employed him reclaimed the property. Laura packed what remained of her life into an SUV and retreated to her mother's cramped trailer on the edge of the county. Toby sent me a single text from a cheap burner phone. "Clara, I swear I didn't know. I'm so sorry." I stared at the screen for a long moment, my thumb hovering over the reply button. Then, I deleted the thread and blocked the number. I didn't hate him, but I was finished carrying his family's weight. That same week, I stood in the courthouse for a different reason. The hearing for the name change took 10 minutes. There was no opposition. When the judge signed the order, Clara Sterling ceased to exist on paper. I walked out into the crisp spring sunlight as Clara Thorne. My legal guardian, Marcus Thorne. I felt lighter than I had since I was 4 years old. Another winter eventually settled over the house on the lake. I stood on the wide cedar balcony, wrapped in one of Marcus's old university hoodies, watching the water freeze into a jagged sheet of glass under a fresh dusting of powder. We were miles away from the city, deep enough into the mountains that no one from my former life would ever show up unannounced. Marcus appeared beside me, holding 2 mugs of steaming cocoa. He handed me one without a word. He already knew I needed the warmth. We drank in silence, watching our breath vanish into the mountain air. That January, he began teaching me to drive. Not on the icy mountain roads, not yet, but on the frozen surface of the lake itself. He marked out a wide oval with orange cones and sat in the passenger seat of his old Suburban while I crept along at 15 miles per hour. Every time the back end fishtailed, I'd laugh, a sound that felt foreign and wonderful. "Easy on the wheel," he would say, his voice a steady anchor. "Trust the surface." On the long winter nights, we stayed up late in the library he had converted into a study for me. It was a room filled with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a fireplace that actually worked. He told me stories of the summer he met my mother in Portland. How she had spilled coffee on his shoes in a rainy cafe and laughed instead of apologizing. How she loved jazz clubs, hated the taste of cilantro, and could outplay anyone at a pool table after 2 drinks. I listened with a hunger I couldn't satisfy, finally piecing together the woman who had fought so hard to protect me from the grave. My phone remained quiet most days. Laura tried calling from an unlisted number twice. I let it ring until it stopped. Toby sent one more long apology, promising to pay me back one day. I read it once and then erased it. Former classmates who suddenly found a renewed interest in our friendship were blocked the moment they sent their first superficial message. I didn't owe them my time. Spring brought the acceptance letter from Stanford University. A scholarship for the business school, based on my academic record and the essay I had written about fiduciary fraud and the anatomy of a second chance. Marcus read the letter over my shoulder. He didn't speak for a long time, but then he pulled me into a hug that made words entirely unnecessary. I still called him Marcus. Not out of spite, but because the word father felt too massive to use all at once. He never pushed me. But once, when I slipped and called him Dad while we were packing for my orientation, he smiled so wide his eyes glistened. He pretended he hadn't noticed, but I knew. I knew what home felt like now. Sometimes, I still open the lockbox on my desk. My mother's letter is soft now, the paper worn thin from being read 1,000 times. I trace her handwriting and I realize that family isn't a matter of blood, or the people who happen to raise you. Family is the person who chooses to stay when the truth gets ugly. It's the person who shows up every single day without keeping a ledger of what you owe them. It's the person who looks at the most broken chapters of your story and tells you that they don't change your worth. Marcus chose that every morning. In every cup of cocoa on the balcony, and every driving lesson on the ice. The people who spent 12 years treating me as an investment lost the right to my life the moment they proved that $1 meant more than a daughter. I am 18 now. The trust is finally, fully mine. I am heading to California in the autumn to study finance, because I want to understand every rule they broke and every loophole they exploited. I want to make sure no other child has to fight this hard just to exist. When people ask me where I'm from, I don't mention the house in the suburbs anymore. I tell them I'm from a house on a lake in the mountains, where someone finally taught me what the word home is supposed to mean. Blood doesn't get to write your ending. The people who stay do.